Hi class, today we're going to talk about the characteristics of life in Chapter 1. We already talked about biology and talking about the fact that it's a study of life. Again, all you have to do is break down these big words in science class, and when you do this, bi or bio means life and ology means a study of, and you're going to get the understanding of them. So that's why we're doing the root words. When we look at biology or living things, we really need to talk about how do you tell if something's living versus is something not living. A lot of people get it really confused. I'll go outside and I'll say pick up 3 things that are living and 3 things that are non living, and they'll pick up a stick, but thinking it's dead, but really that stick used to be a living organism, even though it's no longer living. And so we have to get these characteristics set straight. I like to list them with 9 different characteristics. A lot of different books or other teachers maybe have taught you less than 9. 9 is kind of the max that you go with. You probably only learned 5 actually in your previous class, but I broke a few more down and I made a mnemonic device because there are so many. So the first one is talking about metabolism. All living things could reproduce. All living things could grow and develop. All living things could respond to stimuli. All living things are organized. All living things are made of at least 1 or more cells. They could adapt and evolve. Living things contain DNA, and they can maintain homeostasis, or they are homeostatic. These are the 9 characteristics that make something living. All living things have to have these 9 characteristics or they're not really considered a living organism, such as viruses. Viruses are not considered living organisms. They contain some of these characteristics, but not all 9 of them. So the little device to help you remember it is Mr. Gromack. When I was a college sophomore maybe, one of my biology professors, Dr. Fox, he came up with Mr. Gromack and it stuck in my brain forever, and so that's why I still use it. So let's talk about these characteristics of life one at a time. First one I will talk about is metabolism. Metabolism is a fancy way of saying how do you get your energy and how do you use the energy that you got to maintain life. And so it's really talking about all the chemical reactions that happen inside your body. We call this the biochemistry of living organisms, which we're going to touch on a little bit later on. So how do things obtain and use energy? It's all about energy. And a lot of people will talk about waste too, because when you get energy or food, you're always going to have the waste products. So this guy down here, the chemical energy, you eat proteins, carbs, lipids, fats, and other food. It goes into your body, and what do you do with it? Well, you chemically break it down, and you absorb any nutrients from the food that you ate. What is that nutrients for? Well, it's to produce the body's energy. The body's energy is a type of energy, a molecule called ATP, which we're going to learn about. Your body uses ATP to do everything, all the chemical reactions. And so that's why it's so important. Living things have to be able to get energy and use it and have a way to get rid of any waste products left over in the end. Also, any waste products such as heat can be given off as well. So that's all metabolism, all the chemical reactions in living things. Number 2 is reproduction. All living things have to have a way to pass on their traits to their offspring. And if you can't do this, well, then there's really no purpose for you to be here, because that's the meaning of life, for living things to find a way to survive long enough to reproduce and pass on their traits to their offspring. And so what we have here, there's 2 main ways to reproduce. There's asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So over here, this picture is of a paramecium. It's a single-celled organism that will reproduce not by going and mating, but actually splitting itself into 2. So here's the parent up here. When it's time, it will signal itself to split into 2, and you get 2 new identical smaller copies of whatever the parent was here. This is a cloning process with the occasional mutation that makes them a little bit different, but these are clones of whatever the parent was. Now that's pretty boring, that's not exciting. Most organisms, 99% or more, don't use asexual reproduction because it is a cloning process, and that can be very dangerous, especially if a successful parasite could come around and wipe you out if you can't fight it off. But luckily, for over 99% of all living things on the planet, they reproduce sexually. So that means there has to be donation from a male and a female in the form of egg and sperm usually. And they will meet up, they will mix up their DNA, so different traits get passed on in different combinations, and you get a variety or a diversity in your life instead. That's why we're also different from one another, because of sexual reproduction. Over here, this is another form of asexual reproduction. This is an aquatic animal that lives in pond water called a hydra. And the hydra reproduces actually asexually by doing a process called budding. So budding is when they grow bud right off of them, and it will eventually break off right about there when it's fully developed, or developed as much as it's going to get, and then it will become its own organism, which is a clone of the parent. And you can see another bud starting here. So this is budding, asexual. This is kind of a splitting process. It's called binary fission. And then this is actually sexual reproduction with the egg and the sperm. Next one is growth and development. All living things have to be able to grow and or develop, and they're two different terms. So when we talk about growth, we're just talking about getting bigger. If you're a single-celled organism, you're not really going to have that much development, but you will have growth, so you will actually get bigger, like that paramecium on the other page. Or you'll become more cells. So we all start as one cell. So when the egg and sperm unite, we are one cell called a zygote. That zygote will start to undergo divisions to become 2 cells, and then 4 cells, and then 8, 16, 32, and it'll keep doubling and doubling and doubling. This is a growth process, where you're actually gaining mass. Eventually, all these cells will eventually develop into specialized cells. Heart cells, liver cells, brain cells, nerve cells, whatever type of cells that make up our body, they will actually develop and specialize to do the job that they were made to do. Also, this is another developmental process that you may be more familiar with, the life cycle of the butterfly. So you start off as the egg, right here, right? And then it hatches into the larvae, which you know is caterpillar. And then eventually it eats and eats and eats. It'll form the pupa. Oops. Whoa, wrong way. It'll form the pupa, right there. The pupa forms in the form of a chrysalis, and then of course the adult butterfly emerges, and that's a very developmental process. When you look at a metamorphosis, you can see the development happening in front of your eyes, and growth for that matter. Respond to stimuli is the next characteristic of all living things. They have to be able to respond to anything around them. I usually tell my students, if I were to get a squirt gun and squirt you in the face, you're going to respond to that. It's a stimulus. So stimulus is a word that a lot of people actually get confused. It's just anything that you respond to that's inside of your body or outside of your body, so internal or externally. When organisms respond to their stimuli, they actually have to be able to react to them. So if you grab the handle of a hot pan and it's burning you, you're going to send immediately signals through your nerves to your brain and then back to your fingers saying, hey doofus, get your hand off that, you're going to burn and get hurt. So that's actually responding to stimuli. If there's a gazelle out in the savannah being chased by a lion, well, the gazelle is going to obviously respond to the stimulus of being chased and hunted by the lion. So living things have to be able to respond and respond quickly to survive anything going on inside them or around them. The next thing is all living things are organized. That just means that there's a level of organization. We did this on the first day where you did the levels of organization or hierarchy from the very smallest to the very largest things of life. So if we take one of those examples and we take a cell, the inside parts of a cell are called organelles. These parts of a cell, like the mitochondria, the smooth ER, the rough ER, the nucleus, the Golgi, the cell membrane, all these parts work together for a certain function, and that function helps the cell to actually be alive and make the proteins that it needs to make the organism. And then eventually, if a bunch of cells get together and organize themselves, they could form tissues, and tissues could get together and organize themselves to become organs. So there's an organizational feature from small to big with all life, which is required. All living things have to be made of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. They're the smallest possible living things on this planet. Single-celled organisms, like here's our friend the paramecium again. And so if you are made of one cell, you're called unicellular. If you're made of more than one cells, you are called multicellular. We are multicellular organisms because we're made of trillions. But this paramecium is a unicellular organism. as are bacteria, which are called prokaryotic cells. We are eukaryotic cells. That's just a fancy way of saying, hey, there's a nucleus and all these fun organelles inside that's very specialized. Prokaryotic cells, they're kind of boring. They're small. They're bacteria only, and they lack all the internal parts. Yet they do have some similar features like DNA as other cells. So living things are made of cells. Living things can adapt and evolve over time. And so we have a whole chapter and unit on evolution. And evolution is really just talking about change over time. How is your population as a group, how is your population or group of you going to change through generations? That's evolution. There's obviously changes that are going to occur. So if we look at this population of beetles, there's two different color variations, green and brown. But if they're living in an environment with a brown tree, then the brown ones have a better trait. They're better adapted in that scenario. And they're probably going to be avoid being eaten more so than the green ones, which may stick out and be a little bit more obvious to predators. And so over time, you'll see less green and more brown traits. They will reproduce. And you will see more brown and less green. And eventually some of them are carriers, which means they can pass it on. So if for some reason they start living in green, lush grass, then the green trait is a better trait to have. They are better adapted in that environment, and they will pass on that trait more often than the brown ones, and that's called evolution. And so here's a classic example. In England, there's a species of moth called the peppered moth, and there's a dark version and a light version of the peppered moth. Well, before the Industrial Revolution occurred, the trees were very light and bright colored, and so these light colored moths were better adapted to avoid being eaten, whereas these dark colored moths were kind of out of luck and they were being eaten more often. So there was a higher number of the light ones and a lower number of the darker colors. The Industrial Revolution hit, and all these factories went up, pollution and smog started covering cities and the landscape nearby, and it made the trees very dark. The dark trees made it a better environment for these darker moths, so they started to survive and reproduce more frequently than the light-colored moths. The light-colored moths, there started to be less and less of them, and they reproduced less, and so the population was less, and that's evolution. So who's better adapted to survive and pass on their traits through reproduction? That's what life is all about. Survive and pass on your traits. Two more. DNA. All living things contain DNA. That's our genetic material. So when you reproduce, what are you passing on? You're passing on the instructions for all your characteristics. They get mishmashed and mixed up with potentially your mates. Sometimes they don't if it's asexual. But overall, it's the instructions for life. All living things have to have some sort of instructions that tells them what to be, how to make, how to act, or whatever it may be. So that's in the chemical form of this molecule called DNA, which we didn't really know a lot about even a few decades ago. We didn't figure out that it even looked like this until the 50s, and then after that we didn't really have a good idea of what it did at all. And so it's a very actually more recent thing that we've made lots of advances on and realized how super important this molecule is. This picture down here, this is of our 46 chromosomes. They come in different sizes and shapes, and we will be talking about them later on. And the last one is homeostasis. Homeostasis is a balancing act, and your body doesn't like to be out of whack. So this picture down here is showing somebody that's out of balance. Your body likes to be in balance, so you will try your hardest to stay in a balanced environment. And that's what I mean by maintaining a stable internal environment. You don't want to be too hot, you don't want to be too cold, you don't want to be too hungry or too full, you don't want to be too thirsty or anything out of the ordinary. You need to respond to anything that your body tells you from the inside or anything that you're exposed to on the outside to maintain this balanced state. So when you're cold and you shiver, well, shivering makes your muscles contract and make heat, which keeps you warm. But when you're really hot and your body starts to sweat, it's your body's way of maintaining a balance and maintaining your 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit temperature by letting some excess heat go from your body. And that's homeostasis. So, characteristics of life, there's 9 of them. Remember Mr. Gromack: metabolism, reproduction, growth and development, response to stimuli. They're organized, made of cells, they could adapt and evolve, contain DNA, and they can maintain homeostasis. That's what makes things living. And I hope that was helpful.